His attack comes after the New York Times overnight reported that the president tried to convince Jeff Sessions to take back control of the Russia probe. But that probe now includes digging into why the president tried to do just that and if it is obstruction of justice. Our Shimon Porcupez is in Washington with more. The president not holding back on this one.
No, and he certainly hasn't held back. In the latest series of tweets, he essentially says that he wishes he had picked a different attorney general. Now, the New York Times reporting that the president in March 2017, just after Sessions recused himself from the Russia investigations, that when Sessions flew to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Trump, they had dinner, and that Trump there at that dinner berated the attorney general and told him he should reverse his decision to recuse himself from the Russia investigation. Now, the Times says that that was an unusual and potentially inappropriate request and that Jeff Sessions refused Trump's request. Now, the New York Times, as part of the special counsel's investigation, is looking at this meeting. It's part of its obstruction investigation, as well as the repeated attacks on Sessions by Trump in the media and on Twitter. And, Poppy, as we've been reporting here at CNN, Trump's lawyers are trying to keep Mueller from questioning Trump about these interactions with Sessions, certainly some of the obstruction issues, and about the firing of Comey.
Shimon, thank you for the reporting. With me now to look at the legal side of this is our legal analyst, former special assistant to Robert Mueller when he was at Department of Justice, Michael Zeldin. Michael, thank you for being here. So this president this morning is responding to Trey Gowdy, head of the Oversight Committee, saying on CBS, look, there are a lot of lawyers. The president could have picked someone else to be attorney general. And then the president writes, I wish I did. This all ties into the New York Times reporting that Shimon just laid out, because the New York Times reporting that the president tried to get Sessions to unrecuse himself from the Russia probe because of the issues there causing him to recuse himself is reason for Mueller to look into obstruction of justice here, not just with the firing of James Comey, but with how the president has handled Jeff Sessions. Legally, what are the obstacles here for the president?
So there are a couple of things that this story raises. First, of course, is that Jeff Sessions did in fact do the right thing. The guidelines that he is under as a Justice Department employee require him to recuse himself from an investigation where it is of a campaign that he was a senior member of. So he has no choice but to follow the regulations, and he's doing that properly. The president really has no business asking him to essentially violate the Code of Federal Regulations governing recusals and asking him to, quote unquote, unrecuse himself. So I think the president is out of bounds asking unrecusal from the recused attorney general.
One of the things that the New York Times points out that's interesting is of the 4 dozen or so questions that the Trump team compiled and the New York Times reported on after these conversations with Mueller's team, 8 of them relate to the attorney general, relate to Mr. Sessions. And here's a key one, quote, that Mueller would ask the president. What efforts did you make to try to get him to reverse his recusal? What is Mueller trying to get at here? Intent?
Right. Exactly. And what we've talked about in the past is that obstruction of justice, or in this case, really probably abuse of office, because there's a question about whether you can obstruct justice if you are doing things that you are constitutionally permitted to do. So if there is a abuse of office inquiry, that inquiry is really a mosaic of various components. The firing of Comey, the asking of Comey to let the Flynn investigation go. And now we have this additional group of pieces that all involve whether or not there was undue pressure put on not only Sessions, but also White House counsel Don McGahn to get Sessions to undo himself because of the thought, I was just going to say, just because of the thought that if he had the right guy, then they could stymie this investigation. That's what underlies this.
And the talk about, comparing him to Holder and saying, well, Holder protected Obama, et cetera, and that's what he wanted from Sessions. Just before you go, Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer, his defense to the New York Times and all this reporting is important. Here's what Giuliani says. Unrecused doesn't say bury the investigation. It says on the face of it, take responsibility for it and handle it correctly. Good enough? I mean, is that going to fly with Mueller's team?
Remember, Giuliani was a guy who said a couple of weeks ago, he's only partially there in terms of learning the law and facts. Well, he's still partially there because, as we started at the top of this segment, the law requires Sessions to be recused from an investigation of a campaign on which he was a senior member. So there is no partial pregnancy here. He is pregnant with conflict and he has to recuse himself. So Giuliani's notion that he could partially manage this is just inconsistent with the regulations that govern Sessions' behavior, and good for Jeff Sessions for following the regulations and resisting the calls for him to come back onto the case.
And by the way, executing so many of the president's wishes, perhaps the one in his cabinet who's done that the most, just looking at some of the key things like immigration for this president. Really interesting, Michael Zeldin. Thank you very, very much.